For over 4 decades, the world has mourned the king of rock and roll. Yet the truth about Elvis Presley's final hours remains shrouded in mystery, buried beneath layers of speculation, cover-ups, and heartbreaking silence. But tonight, after 40 years of secrets, we finally pieced together the devastating reality of August 16, 1977, a day that would forever change music history and leave millions of hearts broken across the globe. The lights dimmed at Market Square Arena in Indianapolis, and Elvis Aaron Presley walked off stage for what would be his final performance. Little did the 18,000 screaming fans know they had just witnessed the end of an era. The man who had once gyrated with the energy of youth now moved with the weight of the world on his shoulders, his sequined jumpsuit struggling to contain not just his frame, but the magnitude of his pain. Backstage that night, those closest to Elvis noticed something different. His usual post-show euphoria was replaced by an unsettling quiet. Larry Geller, his spiritual advisor and hairstylist, later recalled how Elvis sat in his dressing room chair, staring at his reflection with eyes that seemed to be looking through time itself. "I feel like I'm running out of road, Larry," Elvis whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant cheers still echoing from the arena. The king had performed "Can't Help Falling in Love" as his finale, as he always did, but this time, witnesses claimed, tears streamed down his face during the last verse. The audience thought it was sweat from the stage lights, but those who knew Elvis understood. This was goodbye. His voice cracked on the final note, a vulnerability that pierced through the grandeur of his persona and revealed the fragile human being beneath the legend. As his private jet, the Lisa Marie, lifted off from Indianapolis that night, Elvis pressed his face against the window, watching the city lights fade into darkness. He had no way of knowing that he would never see another stage, never feel the rush of 10,000 voices singing along to his music, never again experience the pure magic that had defined his existence for over 2 decades. The flight back to Memphis was unusually quiet. Even his entourage, the infamous Memphis Mafia, sensed something profound was ending. Elvis spent most of the journey reading spiritual texts, searching for answers to questions that had tormented him for years. The man who had everything, fame, fortune, adoration, was desperately seeking the one thing that had always eluded him: inner peace. Graceland had always been Elvis's refuge, his escape from the chaos of fame, but as July 1977 unfolded, the mansion began to feel more like a gilded cage. The walls that once echoed with laughter and music now seemed to close in on the king, trapping him in a world where day and night blended into one endless, pharmaceutical haze. Those final weeks at Graceland revealed a man wrestling with demons that fame and fortune could never exorcise. Elvis would wander the halls at 3 a.m., still wearing his pajamas at sunset, lost in a labyrinth of memories and medication. The staff whispered among themselves about their boss's increasingly erratic behavior, how he would sit at the piano in the music room, playing the same melancholy chords over and over, his fingers searching for a song that would never come. Priscilla had taken Lisa Marie to California weeks earlier, and the absence of his daughter's laughter left an unbearable void in the mansion. Elvis would stand in her empty bedroom, holding one of her teddy bears, tears streaming down his face as he whispered apologies to the air. The guilt of his failed marriage, his struggles as a father, and his inability to be the man everyone expected him to be weighed heavily on his deteriorating spirit. Dr. George Nichopoulos, Elvis's personal physician, made frequent visits to Graceland during these final weeks, his medical bag filled with prescriptions that promised temporary relief, but delivered only deeper dependency. The king who once moved millions with his voice now struggled to move through his own home, his steps heavy with the burden of addiction and despair. The Memphis Mafia tried desperately to lift their leader's spirits, organizing impromptu parties and bringing in new faces, but Elvis remained distant, lost in conversations with himself about redemption, legacy, and the crushing loneliness that no amount of fame could cure. He spoke frequently about wanting to return to his spiritual roots, about finding God again, but the path seemed impossibly distant from where he now stood. By the summer of 1977, Elvis Presley was drowning in the very fame that had made him immortal. The man who had revolutionized music, who had broken down cultural barriers and united generations through rhythm and soul, now found himself imprisoned by his own success. Every public appearance was scrutinized, every photograph analyzed for signs of decline, every performance dissected by critics who seemed to forget they were witnessing the final chapters of a living legend. The pressure had been building for years, but those final months revealed just how crushing the weight of being Elvis had become. He could no longer walk through his beloved Memphis without being mobbed, could no longer enjoy simple pleasures like going to the movies or eating at his favorite diner. The spontaneity that had once defined his spirit was suffocated by security, concerns, and media attention that followed his every move. Behind the gates of Graceland, Elvis would often reflect on the boy he used to be, the shy kid from Tupelo, who just wanted to make his mama proud. "I miss being nobody," he confided to his stepbrother Rick Stanley during one of their late-night conversations. I missed being able to fail without the whole world watching." The irony wasn't lost on those who knew him best. The man who had given everything to his fans was slowly losing himself in the process. The constant scrutiny had taken its toll on his relationships as well. Trust became a luxury he could no longer afford, as friends and confidants sold stories to tabloids and former employees wrote tell-all books. Elvis retreated further into his inner circle, but even there, he questioned loyalties and motives. The paranoia that had always lurked beneath the surface of his personality began to consume him, leaving him isolated even among those who claimed to love him most. Sleep became his only escape. But even that was artificial, chemically induced, and far from restful. Dr. Nichopoulos would later testify about Elvis's desperate pleas for medications that would help him forget, if only for a few hours, the enormous expectations placed upon his shoulders. The king of rock and roll was slowly suffocating under the crown that the world had placed upon his head. Despite the chaos that defined his final years, Elvis's capacity for love remained perhaps his most remarkable and tragic quality. Ginger Alden, his girlfriend during those last months, witnessed firsthand the tender heart that beat beneath the tormented exterior. She would later describe moments of unexpected vulnerability, how Elvis would hold her hand during thunderstorms, because he was afraid of the lightning, how he would call her in the middle of the night just to hear another human voice. The end of his marriage to Priscilla had left scars that never fully healed. Elvis carried the weight of that failure like a stone in his chest, constantly wondering if he could have been a better husband, a more present father. His love for Lisa Marie was overwhelming and complex. He saw in her innocent eyes both his greatest joy and his deepest regret. The knowledge that his lifestyle and choices were affecting his relationship with his daughter tormented him more than any critic or failed performance ever could. But perhaps the most painful loss was the gradual erosion of his relationship with Colonel Tom Parker, the manager who had guided his career from obscurity to superstardom. What had once been a partnership built on mutual ambition had devolved into a relationship of dependency and exploitation. Elvis began to realize, in those final months, that his colonel's interests might not always align with his own, but by then, the contractual and financial entanglements made escape seem impossible. The women who passed through his life during those final years all spoke of the same desperate quality in his love, an almost childlike need for constant reassurance and affection. Elvis would shower them with gifts and attention. But beneath the generosity lay a profound fear of abandonment that stemmed from losing his beloved mother, Gladys, nearly 2 decades earlier. That loss had created a wound that never healed, a void that no amount of love or attention could ever completely fill. Even his relationship with his fans, once pure and joyful, had become complicated by his awareness of his own mortality. He knew they loved him, but he wondered if they loved the real Elvis or just the image, the myth, the carefully constructed persona that bore only a passing resemblance to the broken man behind the music. The road to August 16, 1977, was paved with good intentions and small white pills. What began as legitimate medical treatment for chronic pain and insomnia had gradually transformed into a deadly dependency that would ultimately claim the king's life. Dr. George Nichopoulos, known to Elvis and his inner circle as Dr. Nix, had initially provided what seemed like reasonable solutions to very real health problems. Elvis's punishing schedule, his physical ailments from years of high-energy performances, and his chronic insomnia created perfect conditions for pharmaceutical intervention. The pills that helped him sleep were followed by pills that helped him wake up, which led to pills that helped him perform, which required pills to bring him down. It was a vicious cycle that few understood at the time, and even fewer knew how to break. Those closest to Elvis watched helplessly as the man they loved transformed before their eyes. The spontaneous, charismatic performer who had once needed no artificial enhancement to command a stage now couldn't function without chemical assistance. His speech became slurred, his movements sluggish, his once sharp mind clouded by a fog of medications that promised relief but delivered only deeper dependency. The Memphis Mafia tried interventions, pleading with Elvis to seek help, but the king had become defensive about his medication use, claiming he needed them to function, to perform, to simply get through each day. These aren't drugs, he would insist. They're medicine prescribed by a doctor. The distinction, while technically true, had become meaningless as the prescriptions multiplied and the dosages increased. Dr. Nichopoulos would later face intense scrutiny for his prescribing practices, with investigators discovering that he had provided Elvis with thousands of pills in the months leading up to his death. The doctor claimed he was trying to help, trying to manage his patient's pain and suffering, but critics argued he had enabled an addiction that ultimately proved fatal. The truth, as is often the case in such tragedies, likely falls somewhere between negligence and genuine concern gone terribly wrong. August 15, 1977, dawned gray and humid in Memphis. The summer heat already oppressive at 8 a.m. Elvis woke later than usual. his body moving with the sluggish rhythm of someone whose circadian cycles had been disrupted by years of medication and irregular schedules. Little did anyone at Graceland know they were witnessing the last full day of the king's life. 24 hours that would be scrutinized, analyzed, and remembered for decades to come. The day began, routinely enough, with Elvis taking his usual morning medications and spending time with Ginger Alden, who had stayed the night. They talked about upcoming tour dates, about their relationship, about simple, ordinary things that took on profound significance in retrospect. Elvis seemed more contemplative than usual, almost philosophical, as if he sensed something momentous. Approaching around noon, Elvis visited his dentist, Dr. Lester Hoffman, for what would be his final dental appointment. Even this routine visit carried an ominous undertone. Dr. Hoffman prescribed additional pain medication for some dental work, adding to the already dangerous cocktail of drugs in Elvis's system. The king joked with the dental staff, signed autographs, and displayed the charm that had endeared him to millions. But those who knew him well noticed a sadness in his eyes that no amount of humor could disguise. That evening, Elvis made what would be his last public appearance, visiting a local movie theater to watch a late showing of MacArthur, starring Gregory Peck. He had rented out the entire theater, as was his custom, bringing along Ginger and several members of his entourage. Witnesses later recalled how Elvis seemed particularly engrossed in the film's themes of duty, sacrifice, and mortality, occasionally commenting on the similarities between MacArthur's fall from grace and his own complicated relationship with fame and authority. As they returned to Graceland near midnight, Elvis appeared restless, unable to settle into his usual nighttime routine. He wandered through the mansion's rooms, picking up photographs, touching mementos, as if taking inventory of a life that was about to end. The staff, accustomed to their employer's nocturnal habits, thought nothing unusual was happening. But, in retrospect, it seemed like Elvis was saying goodbye to the only place that had ever truly felt like home. As August 16th began in the earliest hours after midnight, Graceland settled into its familiar rhythm of hushed conversations and dimmed lights. Elvis, unable to sleep despite the late hour, moved through his mansion like a restless spirit, pausing at family photographs and gold records that lined the walls of his sanctuary. The oppressive timidity of the Memphis summer seemed to press against the windows, as if the very atmosphere knew something momentous was approaching. Ginger Alden later recalled how Elvis seemed different that night, more introspective, almost ethereal in his movements. He spoke frequently about his mother, Gladys, who had died nearly 20 years earlier, wondering aloud if she was proud of what he had become. "Mama always said I was special," he whispered, his voice carrying the vulnerability of a child seeking reassurance. "I hope she still thinks so." Around 2 a.m., Elvis made his way to the piano in the music room, his fingers finding the keys of Unchained Melody, a song that had taken on special meaning during his recent performances. Those who heard him play that night described his rendition as hauntingly beautiful, filled with an emotion that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere artistry. It was as if he was channeling not just his own pain, but the collective sorrow of a generation that had grown up with his music. The Memphis Mafia members who were still awake gathered quietly in the doorway, recognizing this as one of those rare moments when the public Elvis disappeared completely, leaving only the wounded soul who had been searching for peace his entire adult life. They didn't interrupt, sensing that their boss needed this communion with his music, this temporary escape from the weight of being the world's most famous entertainer. As dawn approached, Elvis finally seemed ready to attempt sleep. Dr. Nick had been called earlier and had provided the usual assortment of medications, designed to quiet the king's restless mind and grant him a few hours of pharmaceutical peace. None of them could have imagined that these would be the last pills Elvis would ever take, the final attempt to find the rest that had eluded him for so many years. The last conversation Elvis Presley would ever have began around 4 a.m. on August 16, 1977, when he called his cousin Billy Smith to discuss spiritual matters that had been weighing heavily on his mind. What started as a routine late-night chat between family members became, in retrospect, the king's final attempt to find meaning in a life that had brought him everything except inner peace. Elvis spoke with unusual clarity. Despite the medications in his system, his voice carrying a weight that Billy hadn't heard since the days following Gladys Presley's death. "I've been thinking about eternity lately," Elvis confided, his words carefully measured as if he was choosing each one for its significance. "About whether the things we do here matter in the grand scheme of things. About whether God can forgive someone who's made as many mistakes as I have." The conversation meandered through memories of childhood, their grandmother Minnie Mae's stories about angels and heaven, and Elvis's growing fascination with Eastern philosophy and meditation. Billy later recalled being struck by his cousin's use of past tense when describing his career, as if Elvis was already viewing his life from some distant perspective. "I gave everything I had to the music," Elvis said. "I hope that counts for something when it's all over." Perhaps most poignantly, Elvis spoke at length about Lisa Marie, expressing regrets about missed opportunities to be the father she deserved. "I want her to remember me as someone who loved her more than life itself," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I want her to know that every decision I made, right or wrong, was because I was trying to build something that would last, something that would take care of her long after I'm gone." The call ended around 5:30 a.m. with Elvis promising to visit Billy and his family soon, a promise that would remain forever unfulfilled. Billy Smith would later say that something in his cousin's voice that morning sounded different, not necessarily foreboding, but somehow final, as if Elvis was tying up loose ends in preparation for a journey he knew he might not return from. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the heavy curtains of Graceland's master bedroom, Elvis Presley made his final attempt at finding the sleep that had eluded him for most of his adult life. Ginger Alden lay beside him, exhausted from their long night of conversation and Elvis's restless wandering through the mansion. She would later testify that around 6 a.m., Elvis took his prescribed sleeping medications and finally seemed ready to surrender to the rest his tormented mind desperately needed. The medications that morning included his usual cocktail of sedatives and painkillers, a combination that had become as routine as brushing his teeth, yet exponentially more dangerous. Dr. Nicopolis had calibrated the dosages based on Elvis's tolerance levels, built up over years of dependency. But what the doctor couldn't account for was the cumulative effect on a body that had been pushed to its limits by decades of prescription drug use. Ginger remembered Elvis's last conscious words, spoken around 9 a.m. as she prepared to sleep herself. "I'm going to the bathroom to read." It was such an ordinary statement, so utterly normal in its banality, that no one could have imagined they were the final words the world would ever hear from the king of rock and roll. He took a book, one of his spiritual texts about meditation and finding inner peace, and made his way to the bathroom adjacent to their bedroom. What happened in those next few hours remains largely shrouded in the privacy that Elvis had always craved but rarely found. Medical experts would later theorize about the exact sequence of events, but the peaceful image that Ginger Alden discovered around 2 p.m. told its own story. Elvis had finally found the rest he had been seeking, though not in the way anyone could have anticipated. The irony was not lost on those who knew him best. The man who had spent his final years unable to sleep had ultimately been claimed by the very medications designed to grant him peace. In seeking to quiet the chaos in his mind, he had unknowingly silenced the voice that had provided the soundtrack for multiple generations. At approximately 2 p.m. on August 16, 1977, Ginger Alden's voice shattered the quiet afternoon calm at Graceland with a scream that would echo through music history. "Elvis," she cried, her voice carrying a terror that immediately brought staff members running from throughout the mansion. What she had discovered in the bathroom adjacent to the master bedroom would change everything, not just for those within Graceland's walls, but for millions of fans around the world who were still unaware that their king was gone. The scene that greeted her was both peaceful and devastating. Elvis was found on the bathroom floor, his spiritual book still clutched in his hands, as if he had been reading about finding peace when peace finally found him. There was no violence, no struggle, no dramatic final moment, just the quiet end of a man who had lived one of the most public lives in history, dying in one of the few private moments he had ever known. Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager and closest friend, was among the first to reach the scene. Years later, he would describe the surreal quality of that moment, how the man who had commanded stages and moved millions with his presence looked almost childlike in his stillness. Finally free from the demons that had tormented him for so many years, he looked peaceful, Joe would recall, like he was just sleeping, like all the pain had finally left him. The Memphis Mafia sprang into action with the efficiency of men who had spent decades protecting their boss, but this time, there was nothing to protect him from except the harsh reality that even kings are mortal. Charlie Hodge called the paramedics while others secured the scene. Their movements automatic, despite the shock that threatened to overwhelm them all. Dr. Nicopolis arrived within minutes, his face already reflecting the weight of what he knew. This discovery would mean not just for Elvis's family and friends, but for his own career and reputation. The doctor who had tried to help the king manage his pain now faced the devastating possibility that his treatments might have contributed to this tragic end. The next hour at Graceland unfolded like a desperate prayer against the inevitable, as paramedics, doctors, and Elvis's closest friends fought against fate itself in a futile attempt to bring back the man who had given them everything. Dr. Nicopolis, his hands shaking as he attempted CPR, refused to accept what his medical training told him was already over. The king of rock and roll was gone, but no one was ready to let him go. The paramedics worked with professional efficiency, their equipment filling the bathroom where Elvis had spent his final moments, seeking peace through spiritual reading. Heart monitors showed the flat lines. That confirmed what everyone feared but no one wanted to acknowledge. Still, they continued their efforts, perhaps understanding that they weren't just trying to save a man's life, but attempting to preserve a piece of American culture that could never be replaced. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, arrived as his son was being loaded into the ambulance, his face a mask of disbelief and anguish. The man who had watched his boy transform from a shy teenager into the most famous entertainer in the world, now faced the unthinkable reality that fame, fortune, and all the love in the world couldn't prevent this moment. "Not my boy," he whispered, his words lost in the chaos of emergency vehicles and gathering staff. The ride to Baptist Memorial Hospital became a frantic race against time that everyone knew was already lost. Dr. Nicopolis continued to work on Elvis during the journey, administering medications and performing procedures that medical protocol demanded, even as his heart told him they were merely going through the motions of a salvation that would not come at the hospital. A full team of medical professionals took over, their efforts lasting another 30 minutes before the official time of death was recorded, 3:30 p.m., August 16, 1977. The king of rock and roll, the man who had revolutionized music and culture, the boy from Tupelo who had conquered the world, was pronounced dead at the age of 42, leaving behind a legacy that would never die and a void that would never be filled. At 4:30 p.m. Central Time on August 16, 1977. Radio stations across America began interrupting their regular programming with 4 words that would forever divide time in two before and after for millions of people: Elvis Presley is dead. The announcement rippled across the globe like a seismic shock, stopping conversations mid-sentence, bringing grown men to tears, and leaving an entire generation feeling suddenly, inexplicably older. In Memphis, the news spread faster than the official announcements, carried by the supernatural communication network that seemed to connect Elvis fans across the world. Within hours, Graceland was surrounded by thousands of mourners, their faces etched with a grief typically reserved for the loss of family members. They came carrying flowers, photographs, and pieces of their own hearts that had somehow become intertwined with the man behind the music. Television networks scrambled to provide comprehensive coverage. But how do you capture the impact of losing someone who had soundtracked the lives of multiple generations? Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in American news, struggled to maintain his professional composure as he delivered the report, his voice catching slightly on the phrase, "The king is dead." Radio DJs who had built careers playing Elvis's music found themselves unable to speak, letting his songs fill the airwaves as the only appropriate tribute to a man whose voice had defined an era. Heartbreak Hotel, Love Me Tender, Can't Help Falling in Love, each song took on new meaning as fans realized they were no longer just entertainment, but monuments to a man they would never see perform again. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the reactions of children who didn't fully understand what death meant but recognized the pain in their parents' faces. A generation that had grown up with Elvis as a constant presence in American culture suddenly faced the reality that even legends are mortal, that even kings must eventually lay down their crowns, while the world mourned publicly, behind the gates of Graceland. Elvis's family and closest friends grappled with a grief too profound for public consumption. Vernon Presley, the father who had watched his son transform from a poor boy with a dream into the most famous man in the world, now faced the unbearable task of planning his child's funeral. The man who had protected Elvis from poverty in his youth now had to protect his memory from the circus that fame inevitably creates around tragedy. Priscilla arrived from California with Lisa Marie, the 9-year-old daughter who would now carry forward the Presley legacy without her father's guiding presence. The sight of the little girl who so resembled Elvis, standing confused and heartbroken in the foyer of Graceland, brought fresh tears to eyes that had already cried more than seemed humanly possible. How do you explain to a child that her daddy, who seemed larger than life, was never coming home? The Memphis Mafia, the brotherhood that had surrounded Elvis for 2 decades, found themselves lost without their leader. These men had defined their entire adult lives around protecting and serving the king, and now faced an uncertain future without the magnetic force that had held them together. They moved through Graceland like ghosts, each confronting their own guilt about whether they could have done something, anything, to prevent this tragedy. Ginger Alden, the young woman who had shared Elvis's final months and discovered his body, retreated into a shocked silence that would last for months. The weight of being the last person to speak with Elvis, of finding him in his final moments, created a burden that no amount of counseling could completely lift. She had loved a legend and lost a man, experiencing both the ultimate intimacy and the ultimate loneliness in the span of a few terrible hours. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager and the man who had guided his career from obscurity to remained strangely focused on business matters, making phone calls about contractual obligations and posthumous releases. Some saw this as callous opportunism, but those who knew the Colonel understood it was his way of grieving, by ensuring that Elvis's legacy would be properly preserved and protected in the chaos that was sure to follow. The autopsy of Elvis Presley, conducted by Dr. Jerry Francisco, the Shelby County medical examiner, was perhaps the most scrutinized medical examination in entertainment history. What the autopsy revealed would fuel decades of controversy, conspiracy theories, and painful questions about prescription drug abuse in America. The truth that emerged from that examination room was both more complex and more tragic than the simple explanations the public desperately wanted. Dr. Francisco's initial public statement attributed Elvis's death to cardiac arrhythmia. Essentially, his heart stopped beating. But the toxicology report painted a far more disturbing picture, revealing a cocktail of prescription medications in Elvis's system that would have been dangerous for anyone, let alone someone whose body had been weakened by years of similar chemical assaults. The levels of codeine, quaaludes, and other sedatives found in his blood created what medical experts would later describe as a perfect storm of pharmaceutical interaction. The examination also revealed the physical toll that Elvis's lifestyle had taken on his body. At 42, he had the cardiovascular system of a much older man, his organs showing the stress of years of irregular schedules, poor diet, and chemical dependency. His colon was severely impacted, likely contributing to the chronic pain that had driven much of his prescription drug use, a vicious cycle where the treatment for one problem created others that required additional treatment. Perhaps most tragically, the autopsy suggested that Elvis's death was entirely preventable. Had he received proper addiction treatment, had his prescription drug use been properly monitored, had the warning signs been recognized and addressed, the king of rock and roll might have lived to see his daughter grow up, might have continued making music for decades more, might have found the peace he so desperately sought through healing rather than medication. The autopsy report became a closely guarded document, with the Presley family fighting to keep many details private. They understood that Elvis's fans wanted to remember him as the vibrant performer who had given them so much joy, not as the tragic figure whose final years had been consumed by pain and pharmaceutical dependency. In death, Elvis Presley achieved something that had eluded him in life: true immortality. The man who had spent his final years struggling with the weight of his own fame found in death a freedom that allowed his music, his spirit, and his cultural impact to transcend the limitations of mortality. August 16, 1977, marked not just the end of Elvis's life, but the beginning of his eternal reign as the undisputed king of rock and roll. The funeral at Graceland, held on August 18, drew over 75,000 mourners from around the world, turning Memphis into a pilgrimage destination that it would remain for decades to come. Presidents and paupers, celebrities and factory workers, all came to pay their respects to a man who had somehow belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. The image of his white Cadillac hearse, moving slowly through the gates of Graceland, became one of the most iconic funeral processions in American history. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Elvis's death was how it seemed to purify his legacy. The tabloid stories about his prescription drug use, his weight gain, his erratic behavior, all of it faded away in the face of the music he had left behind. Radio stations that had been reluctant to play his newer material suddenly rediscovered the catalog of songs that had changed the world. His voice, once again, became the soundtrack for a generation's grief. The revelation of his final hours, as details slowly emerged over the following decades, painted a picture of a man who had been searching for peace right up until his final moments. The spiritual books found with his body, the conversations about redemption and eternity, the gentle way he spent his last day, all of it suggested that perhaps Elvis had found in death the tranquility that had eluded him in life. Today, more than for decades after that tragic August day, Elvis Presley remains more famous than ever, his music still moving new generations, his stories still inspiring artists around the world. Graceland has become America's most visited private home, a shrine where fans continue to leave flowers, letters, and pieces of their hearts for a man who gave them the soundtrack to their lives. Conclusion: the final hours of Elvis Presley's life reveal not just the tragic end of a musical legend, but the very human story of a man who gave everything to his art and his fans, leaving himself searching for the peace he had given to millions through his music. Those last conversations about eternity and redemption, his gentle interactions with loved ones, his final attempt to find rest while reading about spiritual enlightenment, all paint a picture of someone who remained, despite his fame and fortune, fundamentally decent and searingly honest about his own struggles. Perhaps the most profound revelation is that Elvis spent his final day, much as he had lived his entire life, thinking about others before himself, worrying about his daughter's future, seeking meaning beyond the temporary pleasures of fame, and ultimately surrendering to a peace that had long eluded him. In death, he found what he had been searching for in life, and in sharing his story, he continues to touch hearts and inspire souls more than 40 years after his voice fell silent. The king is dead, but the music lives forever. His final hours remind us that legends are still human, that even the greatest among us struggle with pain and doubt, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is continue searching for meaning even when the world seems determined to reduce them to just an image, a brand, or a memory. What do you think about these revelations of Elvis's final hours? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from music history.